Raise the flag.
Light the cauldron.
We declare the Games Odyssey open. Welcome to the Games Odyssey podcast, your home for stories of glory from the Olympics and Paralympics. I'm Jonathan Jordan.
And I'm Sarah Patton. We both love the Olympic and Paralympic Games, and we love history. But most of all, we love Olympic and Paralympic history.
From the epic and inspirational moments we all love, to the more bizarre and controversial moments, we're fascinated by it all.
Which is why we are on a journey through all of the Olympic and Paralympic Games, from the ancient Olympics held at Olympia, all the way to now.
All right, we are back, and in this episode, we are headed to Los Angeles, 1932. So, after being told, hey, wait your turn, guys, back in 1928, the City of Angels finally gets the chance to host the Summer Olympics for the first time. Of course, it will come back there, and we'll get to those in future episodes, but this is the original edition, the OG LA Games. So when the Great Depression hits the global economy in 1930, kind of like we talked about in last episode, neither Los Angeles nor the Olympic movement are immune from its effects, of course. Despite this, Los Angeles gets to introduce several innovations that are still a part of the Olympic movement to this day, even if the impact of those innovations would be somewhat overshadowed by the 1936 Games in Berlin. Sarah, just like we say a lot of times, we have to kind of kick things off asking, hey, what did you already know about Los Angeles 1932?
Yeah, good question. If you listened to our last episode, I feel like my response is very similar in that I feel like I knew of Los Angeles 1932 kind of laying the groundwork for a really big Summer Olympic Games in 1984. And so I feel like, and again, we're millennials, so we are very much more familiar with the modern 1984 Olympics. And then, of course, in the United States, we know that Los Angeles is getting ready to host 2028 Olympics. So right. I feel like I'm already kind of biased towards just LA 1932 being kind of the groundwork, but I also know that that means it's easy to skip over really important stuff that happened. I know that there were several key moments for athletes at 1932. I know that there's a particular athlete from Texas that we're going to talk about, and I knew that she really shined at 1932. And then, of course, and I'll talk about this in the highlights, there is a fun little story about a little puppy. And we like dogs and we like mascots on this show. Maybe one of us likes mascots more than the other, but yeah. But
I do like dogs though, so that helps.
Overall, I feel like there are some key things that I knew, but not a ton of details. What about you?
No, I mean, same thing. I knew that LA had hosted the games prior to 1984, but I think if you would ask me, I probably would have gotten the year wrong. I probably would have been like, oh, yeah, I think it was 1928, probably because I would have just been thinking of the 2028 games coming up. But again, researching this episode, there were some names that popped out to me that were like, oh, OK, that was these games here. So that was kind of fun, once again, to connect the dots. And as we'll talk about probably a couple times in this episode, I do feel like these games have been, frankly, just historically overshadowed because of what happened 4 years later. So it's really easy to talk about 1936 because they were such huge games and so much happened there that people, even non-Olympic fans, talk about the 1936 games. And so I think LA 1932 just kind of gets slightly forgotten about because of that. So this is our chance to bring out their story and help those games be remembered for what they were. And to help start that conversation, let's get into some highlights.
So some highlights of Los Angeles 1932. The games ran from July 30th to August 14th. There were 1,332 athletes from 37 nations competing in 117 medal events. due to the Great Depression and the travel difficulties for many to even reach California, this was the lowest level of participation since 1904 in St. Louis. There were several innovations here, including the first full-fledged Olympic Village. Other innovations included automatic timing and the photo finish, which ended up being used to determine the winner of the 100-meter final. But more on that later. This is one of my favorite highlights, of course. This was the first time the Games had an official mascot, a Scottish Terrier by the name of Smokey. And there were two demonstration sports, American football and lacrosse. So I feel like American football definitely makes sense because that's a big deal here.
Sure.
Yeah. And specifically American football, we know there's a difference between that and what we call soccer, which the rest of the world calls football, because Americans just like to do their own thing.
Right. We have
know
to do
that.
everything different. Yeah.
I know. Anyway, so Jonathan, have you been to the Olympic Stadium in Los Angeles?
I have not. Even though I've been to LA multiple times, I've just always had other things I've been committed to when I'm in Los Angeles. I have seen some other Olympic related things there, such as going to do some research at the LA 84 Foundation, which is a really cool place to visit if you ever get the chance. I've been to the Helms Bakery, which used to make bread for the Olympic team, which we'll talk about that in our 1948 London episode for sure. But yeah, I have not had the chance to actually go to the Olympic Stadium in Los Angeles. It's high on my list for the next time I go there, though. And
I feel bad because I'm realizing that we're calling it the stadium.
Yeah.
When it's actually the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum is the official name of it. But a fun fact that I happen to know, and I'm confirming that this is true. And of course, these are just like those little things that other people may not find as cool as I do, but
they're cool. Claim it.
This will be
cool.
The first stadium that will have hosted this Summer Olympics 3 times once it hosts the 2028 Summer Olympics.
Oh, yeah. I guess so. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. So
that's wild.
I love it because it shows that, you don't have to build a new stadium. I'm sure that there's renovations and all that. And I know they've done a lot of work on it. And I know that college football teams use it. And it's a very special stadium or Coliseum. Yeah. I had the privilege to go there in, I want to say it was 2015. I actually went to an opening ceremony there for the Special Olympics World Games. Very similar to the Olympics. They do every 4 years, the Special Olympics World Games. And my husband was working for a company at the time that helped sponsor the games. And so he asked me if I wanted to fly out for his volunteer work. And so I was like, yeah, I'll go with you. While you volunteer, I'll just mosey around LA and see what I can get into. But it was really cool because it was very similar to an Olympics or Paralympics opening ceremony. You had athletes from all over the world, and Nadia Comaneci was there to help open the games. And of course, I was geeking out over that, but it was really cool. It gave me kind of a preview of what we could hope to experience in 2028 as participants and seeing what it looks like to be in a full stadium cheering for all these different countries walking in. And so, yeah, that's my very limited experience. I'll see if I have pictures to share from this stadium, but I feel kind of proud, like 1928 and 1932. I've been to both of those stadiums.
I had not made that connection that same stadium will have been used 3 times. And yes, like you said, they've updated things and renovated. I'm sure they've had to change the Wi-Fi password from what it was in 1932, but still the fact that the same venue could be used over the course of almost 100 years, 3 times is really cool to think about. So, I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. But, and I'm no expert here when it comes to buildings and sustainability and stuff, but I'm just saying, like, maybe there's a lesson here that you don't always have to tear down one stadium to build another in a host city that gets the Olympics more than once. I'm just saying, like, let's do this.
It's a very valid point for sure. But yeah, let's take a quick little break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the story of how the games ended up here in LA. All right, so it's actually a pretty short background story for this episode about how the games ended up in Los Angeles, but here we go. So the Los Angeles bid was led by local LA businessman William May Garland. In 1920, he traveled to the IOC headquarters in Lausanne to suggest LA as a host city. And the IOC was like, hey, okay, build a stadium and we'll think about it. It was basically one of those, if you build it, they will come sort of situations. Okay. So I don't know if maybe they were trying to call his bluff or what the deal was, but William Garland, he went back to LA and he got the thing done. So he led this drive to build the Los Angeles Coliseum that you were just talking about. And then he came back to the IOC in 1923 and said, hey, we did it. We built the building. So what do you think? And then kind of like we talked about in our 1928 episode, he was really hoping that LA would get the 1928 games, but the IOC had already promised those to Amsterdam. They'd been waiting to host for a long time. So basically they said, okay, cool. Thanks for getting that done. Tell you what, you can have 1932. So there were no other serious bids for these games since they had already awarded them to Los Angeles. So pretty low drama, honestly. And then to keep costs low, Sarah, kind of like you were just talking about, existing venues were used.
What a concept.
Right. Yeah. So that included turning the Rose Bowl into a temporary velodrome for the cycling events. In fact, the only new venue that they constructed for these games was the swimming stadium. That's it. So, yeah, that's kind of almost unthinkable nowadays that you would only have to build new one venue. Now, okay, we recognize there's a lot more sports now than there were back then. So a lot of times that's part of why we have to see new venues built, but still, great concept here. Now, you had mentioned in the highlights that this was the lowest attendance for a summer games since St. Louis. So of the 1,300 athletes, give or take, that competed, 474 came from the host nation of the U.S. No surprise there, since we're the host country at this point. And then here's what I thought was interesting was the second largest delegation was the 157 athletes from Japan. So
that is really interesting.
Yeah, it really kind of caught me by surprise that they had the second most.
Do you think it has anything to do with a geographic location when I guess they saw as like, oh, it's easier to get to the west coast of the United States than, say, Paris or something? You know, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the travel situation definitely made an impact because for Japan, yes, the Pacific is huge, but there's a pretty clear avenue that they could take. Whereas a lot of the European nations, the challenge that they would have faced is typically they would have had to come to the East Coast first, and they would have had to come to like New York or Boston, and then they would have had to get on a train and travel almost 2,000 miles to the opposite coast. So the expense of that and the difficulty of that is what really made it hard for as many athletes to attend these games as prior games. So yeah, Japan, I think you hit the nail on the head. That's why they were able to send so many athletes, is because they got on a boat and I don't know, maybe they stopped in Hawaii to refuel, but then it was on to LA. And speaking of Japan and kind of how some of the historical events happening around this time or leading up to World War II. So not long before these games, they had actually invaded Manchuria and begun their occupation of China, which we know, of course, is a huge event that helps lead up to World War II. The reason I mention that as part of this kind of background story is because the Republic of China sent only one athlete but that marked their first official appearance in the games. And some people think that they really only sent that one athlete really more as a kind of a political gesture of, hey world, we're here, like pay attention to what's happening. Again, I don't really know whether that's the case or not, but I think it's interesting to at least point out that we see some of these things happening in the background of the Olympic movement, which of course is dedicated to the idea of peace. So anyway, I don't really have any real discussion topic for us on this today. It's just something that I felt like needed to be said as we are looking ahead to some of the events that are going to happen later, especially given the fact that Japan was supposed to host the 1940 games, which will end up getting canceled. So anyway, let's just go ahead and get into some of the opening ceremony stuff, kicking off the games. Take it away.
Okay, so despite the lower number of athletes, when the opening ceremony was held on July 30th, a record number of spectators piled into the Coliseum Olympic Stadium. 100,000 people. In fact, it was literally sold out, with the last ticket selling on the day of the opening ceremony, which that seems
bonkers.
Really impressive considering the Great Depression. The games were opened by Charles Curtis, who was the vice president of the U.S. at the time. He is the first and only vice president to open the Olympics in the United States. As mentioned in the highlights, this was the first time we saw a true Olympic village as we would think of it today. While previous games had provided accommodations, this is the first time it was truly a self-contained, full-service village according to the book Total Olympics. Oh, but of course, this was just for the male competitors. The women were put up in the Chapman Park Hotel. So, I mean, I'm grateful that it's not like they were like, hey, ladies, go find your own accommodations, but also, good grief. And I get that it was very common to still have men and women be very separated in some ways back then. But they could have had their own part of the village. I mean, like they do now, women's rooms, men's rooms. I don't know. Anyway, so I guess some of the shenanigans you hear about going down in the Olympic Village probably were not happening at these Olympics, but we're not getting into that.
Right. Nope.
I'm just over here stirring the pot. Apparently, people were concerned about whether athletes would get along with each other in such close quarters, but the Olympic spirit of peace did seem to prevail. So that's good.
Yeah.
In the village, athletes had access to 5 dining halls, a post office, a radio station, a fire station, a movie theater, and even their own hospital. In Total Olympics, there's a quote from U.S. 4x100 relay member Frank Wyckoff, who said of the village, "Being able to visit throughout the village, trying to overcome the language differences with representatives of 56 nations was a rare delight." Not sure where he got the number 56 from, since there were only 37 nations there. But, math is hard.
Yeah. Maybe he was counting some other states as other countries.
Maybe.
Sometimes it can feel like here in the U.S., sometimes it feels like members of other states are from a different country. But I don't know where he got 56 from.
I don't see this being the case, but I'm unless there were staff and volunteers maybe from other countries that
maybe
did not have athletes, but I feel like with the time period, that's very unlikely.
Yeah. Still, it's a great quote to show just the spirit of the Olympic Games in the village. And like you said, apparently this was a concern of people thinking, oh no, or is everyone going to get along in this environment? Or are they going to be getting into fights with each other? And they didn't. They actually seemed to love being around all these other, cultures together and having that cultural exchange happen. Once again, so long as they were male, as you pointed out. But I do hope that the women athletes, at the very least, were allowed to take advantage of some great room service in the hotel. But still, they did not get the same perks. Let's recognize that. So on that note, let's go ahead and take another quick little break. And then when we come back, we will get into the events themselves. All right, we're going to start things off over in women's fencing, where we have a really great story of Olympic sportsmanship at these games. So, to set the stage, we've got Judy Guinness of Great Britain, who was facing off against Ellen Priesa of Austria in their final match together. So Guinness was about to be declared the winner of their bout when she then approaches the officials and lets them know that they had actually missed 2 touches that were made by Priesa, which meant Priesa had won the match instead of her. So, yeah, I mean, she could have been quiet about the situation and gone home with a gold medal because the judges they didn't have the fancy systems like we have now. She could have just let it slide and been like, well, that's tough breaks. And she did the honest thing and said, hey, you missed 2 touches she made. Like, she beat me.
What a champion.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what we call a golden silver medal right there.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But it's just a really cool story from these games that, again, kind of highlights what we were just talking about in the Olympic Village, like this just sense of camaraderie between athletes from different nations, even as they're competing against each other. And then something else I thought was kind of interesting, and I apologize, I didn't dig deeper into the reasons behind it, but there was no football tournament in Los Angeles. Football got completely removed from the program for these games, which I find a little bit shocking, and I'm surprised there wasn't an international uproar given the popularity of football in other countries. But there you have it. I don't know. Maybe it was a cost-saving thing that they said, hey, we can't build a whole other stadium just for football, so we're just not going to have it. Again, I don't know the full story, so if someone else does, happy to hear it.
I mean, my only speculation would be, I wonder if they were like, American football is a demo sport.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's a good point. They were like, it's going to be our version of football, maybe. But I just found it really interesting that a sport as popular as football got cut for these games. So
maybe it's Americans being Americans. That's my only guess, but I have no idea, frankly.
Yeah. But of course, football, soccer, whatever you want to call it, is really popular here now. So, I don't see that happening again.
No, I feel like if it were to get cut again, there would be a lot of riots.
Yeah, there would be, for sure. Or, I mean, again, I did not dig into the story. So for all I know, it could have been a FIFA thing as well. There could have been something going on in FIFA where they were like, True. Yeah, we're not doing that. Again, I don't know. So I know I'm blaming ourselves, but maybe we had nothing to do with it. I don't know. But anyway, we'll get into areas that I do know and did do research in, which is swimming. So over in women's swimming, Helene Madison of the U.S. was a dominant force. She won gold in all 3 events she competed in: the 100-meter freestyle, the 4x100-meter relay, and the 400-meter freestyle. So she's kind of a repeat story of Athelda Bleibtree, who we talked about a while back ago. And then speaking of the 100-meter, she barely qualified for the final in that event. And during the final, she even bumped into a lane divider, but she still won. So she must have been really, really going at it to be able to have those kind of problems and still win. And then she was the anchor leg for the relay team, which ended up breaking the world record by 9.5 seconds. So
that's a long time.
That's a really long time. Like, next time you have a chance, count out 9.5 seconds to get a idea of how long that really is. And then in the 400 meter, it was a really close finish, and she barely edged out her teammate Lenora Kite. That night, she ended up celebrating this third gold medal by going out to the Coconut Grove nightclub, where, according to Olympics.com, she danced with actor Clark Gable. So good for her, I guess.
Casual.
Mingling with the stars after her Olympic victory. And then hopping over real quick to men's swimming, Kusuyo Kitamura of Japan won gold in the 1,500 meter freestyle race. Get this, he was only 14 years old. And, we're used to seeing some teenage stars in swimming. Like, that's not completely unusual, but he is still the youngest male Olympic champion of all time. And then he retired from competitive swimming after the game so he could, go finish school because he was 14 years old. So
it's ridiculous.
Yeah. So went out on top and then went back to class, I guess. And here's what was also really bonkers. Speaking of this team from Japan, Team Japan won 5 of the 6 gold medals in men's swimming in Los Angeles, including a complete podium sweep of the 100-meter backstroke. So they just were a dominant force here in swimming like nothing else. And then in diving, speaking of sweeping, the U.S. swept every single event in both men's and women's. Georgia Coleman won gold in the women's 3-meter springboard, and she also won silver in the 10-meter platform, coming in second to Dorothy Poynton. Then over in men's diving, we had a similar situation with Michael Galitzin and Harold Smith going 1-2 in the 3-meter. And then in the 10-meter platform, it was Harold Smith and Michael Galitzin just trading places. So we understand there were a lot more U.S. athletes than anyone else there. And we've always, at this point in the history of diving, U.S. was just really, really strong.
Now, I bet you did not expect to see alpinism here, but it had technically been a medal event at the 1924 Chamonix Winter Games, and now it showed up on the official list of events here because a gold medal was awarded to German brothers Franz and Toni Schmidt of Germany for, quote, making the first ascent to the north face of the Matterhorn. So I was surprised to see alpinism here.
Yeah, it was a strange thing to show up, given the last time we saw it listed was a Winter Games. But, I feel like it's important to point it out because even though it's very different than other Olympic competitions, it is kind of paving the way for climbing events that we now see happening.
Right. Yeah. And then, of course, we've got to talk about rowing. So let's talk for a second about Hugh Edward of Great Britain. First, he won a gold in the coxless pairs event. Then, when the coxless fours team had a member come down with influenza, they asked him to sub in, and so he won a second gold medal.
Just a surprise gold medal.
These are the kind of stories where I'm like, dang it. Like, these people that just kind of end up subbing in and coming away with the Olympic champion. Like, I don't know.
But let's recognize too that like subbing in for rowing is really, really difficult because those teams, like they have, especially when you're talking about coxless fours here. So there's no, coxswain at the front of the boat, like to call out the pace and everything. Like they have to be working really well together as a team for their pace. And you're just going to sub in a guy for, for the Olympics and win. That's impressive.
No, it's very, very impressive. During World War II, he was a member of the Royal Air Force. And when his crew's plane was damaged in a battle, they had to ditch it into the ocean. He put his rowing skills to use, rowing a dinghy through the mine-infested waters, and was the only member of his crew to survive. After the war, he returned to rowing as a coach. So that's just astounding. I hate it that he was the only one to survive, but it's also incredibly impressive that he was able to use his rowing skills to manage.
Yeah. I mean, and the fact that he did that through mine infested waters, like, that's just a whole other level of nerve wracking that can't compare to the nerves you feel at the Olympics.
Yeah. So like when you think about the fact that he did that and just the pressure, knowing what he was facing, it's like, oh, you were very gifted as a human being. No wonder you were able to sub in for your buddy and get a gold medal.
Yeah, seriously. So
it's a special kind of grit.
Yeah. So hats off to Hugh Edward of Great Britain. Incredible story for sure. But yeah, let's take a little bit of a break and then we will come back and get into some gymnastics. All right. So I was really surprised by this, but for some reason, women did not compete officially in gymnastics here in Los Angeles 1932, the way that we got to see them compete in Amsterdam 1928, though they did do some exhibition performance type things. This is just a complete guess on my part, but if I had to guess the reason why, I think it's probably because women's gymnastics wasn't very popular yet in the US at this point. In fact, I looked back to kind of check my theory on this, Sarah, and noticed that the U.S. did not send a women's team for Amsterdam 1928, even though women competed there. So I think maybe I'm on to something here.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the idea of women's gymnastics not being popular in the U.S. is unthinkable today. But again, 100 years ago, very different situation. So we'll just jump right into talking about the men. So the real star of men's gymnastics at these games was Italian gymnast Romeo Neri. Or is it Romeo? Romeo, tomato. He was the star. And he won 3 gold medals, including winning the individual all-around, which he won, by the way, by 5.7 points. Okay. I go to men's gymnastics competitions for, my son all the time. We watch it on TV. The idea of someone winning anything by 5.7 points is just unthinkable nowadays. But he did it. He also won golds in the team all around and also in parallel bars. He was also apparently a gifted swimmer, weightlifter, runner, and boxer. He just did everything, apparently. Now, after World War II, he rejoined the world of gymnastics by coaching the Italian team for the 1952 Helsinki Games. And then another standout in the men's gymnastics competition was Hungarian athlete István Pelle, who won 2 gold medals for floor and pommel horse. He also won 2 silvers for the individual all-around and parallel bars. And then also one of the featured gymnastics events here that I have to talk about because it's too weird not to talk about was Indian clubs, which is also sometimes referred to as club swinging. We mentioned this briefly back in our 1904 St. Louis episode. So, just once again, this is not going swinging at the club. This is club swinging, different thing. This was its second and last appearance in the Olympics, and it was won here by George Roth of the U.S., who, the U.S. actually swept this event because really this is a discipline that's only done in America, at least in 1932. So something interesting about George was that at the time he competed, he was unemployed because of the Great Depression. And he later admitted he stole food from the Olympic Village for his family to be able to have something to eat while he was at the games. And then he ended up having to hitchhike home because that was the only way he was going to get home. And then after that, we don't really know what happened to him. He just kind of disappeared into obscurity, which I don't know. I think that's kind of sad considering he's a gold medalist. But
yeah, I cannot imagine picking up a hitchhiker and it being an Olympic champion.
Right. Yeah. Like, oh, so what are you up to? Oh, I was just over at the stadium swinging some clubs, won a gold medal. Now I got to get home. It's just kind of a sad story, too, that you've got this poor guy who, even though this is a very obscure sport and isn't practiced anymore, really, he was really good at it. And I hope things turned out for him and his family for the best, but we just don't really have any more information about his life after this point. So there you go. And I think you had mentioned back in our 1904 episode that to some degree, I don't know, maybe club swinging still kind of exists in the rhythmic gymnastics that doesn't get quite the same attention that artistic gymnastics does. But we do see some of those skills used by those athletes to this day. So I guess it kind of lives on in that way. And then rope climbing had been cut from Amsterdam 1928, but it was brought back here for 1932, and Americans swept the podium in rope climbing. They also swept the podium in the tumbling event. So yes, tumbling was included as a medal event here. That's no longer a part of the gymnastics program, but for some reason, the LA organizers just really stacked all these kind of more obscure Olympic gymnastics events into the program. And it paid off for Americans, apparently.
Maybe there's a reason for that.
Yeah, no more horsing around on that. Let's talk a little bit about equestrian.
Well, we don't talk about equestrian events that often, but like you said, no horsing around today. A standout at the 1932 games was Frenchman Xavier Francois Lesage, who won 2 golds in dressage.
Hey, that's a rhyme. How about that?
I know. Did you mean to do that?
Lesage and dressage. No.
It's an easy way. I mean, don't want to say we're poetry experts over here, but also Takaichi Nishi of Japan won a gold in individual show jumping with his horse Uranus, which remains Japan's only gold medal in equestrian. During World War II, he served as a colonel in the Japanese military and was stationed on the island of Iwo Jima, where he died in 1945. He is actually portrayed in the Clint Eastwood film Letters from Iwo Jima,
which is an excellent movie. If you've never seen it,
I've not seen that movie.
Here's the deal. It's kind of a slow movie because even though it is a war movie, most of it is about these Japanese soldiers kind of mentally preparing for the battle that's coming their way, knowing that there's no escape from this island and that they are going to lose the battle.
Interesting.
So it's a really interesting drama, just seeing how these soldiers, again, mentally prepare for it. They write these letters, to their loved ones. That's where the title comes from. But if you go into watching it like expecting a typical war movie with lots of bullets flying and explosions, you're probably going to be let down. It's just really not that type of movie. But yeah, he is one of the people portrayed in it because he was a significant figure in that battle. So
interesting. Yeah. And, I feel like we are always hearing here, as in the United States, we're always hearing about Iwo Jima from the perspective of the Americans. So super interesting. I've just heard of the movie. I didn't know that it was from the perspective of the Japanese soldiers. So
yeah. And, so you do have to read subtitles because the vast majority of the movie is in Japanese. So yeah, we're not a movie podcast, so we'll just move on.
No, but in case you haven't listened to us discuss our movies, our top 10 Olympic and Paralympic movies, Jonathan is very much the movie expert, and I'm just here along for the ride because I like movies, but I'm certainly not a movie buff. And so anyway, moving on, we're going to talk about wrestling. So Ivar Johansson of Sweden won gold in both freestyle wrestling and Greco-Roman wrestling. What's interesting is in freestyle, he was classified as a middleweight and in Greco-Roman as welterweight. He would win a 3rd gold medal in Greco-Roman wrestling at the 1936 games in Berlin. So you could say he was kind of good at that.
he was pretty good at. But yeah, it is interesting that he was in a completely different weight class. I guess, I mean, I love watching wrestling, but I admit I don't know all the rules as well as I probably should, as much as I like watching it. So, I don't know if this is still the case where the two different styles, like, freestyle versus Greco-Roman, whether the weight classes are just completely independent of each other. I don't know if that's still the case. So if someone out there is a wrestling expert and wants to let us know, we would love to learn the story behind that.
Yeah. So moving on to athletics, which we love. Women were able to compete in athletics again, but there was a rule that they could only compete in 3 events total.
Boo!
Yeah. Send all the boos. That's right.
Yeah.
Take that 1932 committee. Hope they heard us. So,
yeah.
A familiar name for many people in Texas and probably the United States. We had
the world.
Yes, yeah. But I'm also trying to. It should be a worldwide name, but I'm also trying to be aware that we're in Texas and she's a legend in Texas. Right. So her name is Mildred Didrikson, but she also went by Babe. So you may be familiar with Babe Didrikson. And of course, there's another part of her name that we'll get to in a second. She's widely considered one of the greatest all-around female athletes of all time. In fact, in the 1932 AAU championships before the Olympics, her team, Employers Casualty, won the team title. Babe was the team. Like, just her. Let's be clear about that.
Yeah, like she had to enter as a team, even though it was just her, and she won the team title.
Yep. So she was from Beaumont, Texas, and in 1932, she was only 19 and working as a typist for an insurance company, Employers Casualty, which also Beaumont. Yeah. Gotta say, I used to live near Beaumont down in Lumberton, and it's a very interesting part of Southeast Texas. So there's that. But that's also why I'm like, yeah, of course. Like as a child living in Lumberton, everyone knew about Babe Zaharis. But again, we'll get to Zaharis in a minute. But just wasn't sure how common that name is everywhere else. But there were statues of her everywhere and everything. So it's really cool that I got to learn about her. But anyway.
I love that she just named her team, a.k.a. her, after her employer. That she was like, if I have to have a team name, I'm Employers Casualty, I guess.
Yeah,
so,
represent.
Like I probably would have been like Team Awesome, just do something like that. But
no kidding. One of her nicknames was the Texas Tornado. And she was known for her confident attitude, including saying things like, I came out to beat everybody in sight, and that's just what I'm going to do. So love that. Love that confidence. I'm sure Pierre de Coubertin would just be thrilled.
He was retired. You know what? Like,
this is like the kind of stuff he didn't want to see, and I'm here for it. Like, get over it, dude. Yeah. In Los Angeles, she actually tore her right shoulder in the javelin throw, but she still set a world record because, of course, she did. 2 days later, she set a world record in the 80-meter hurdles, winning gold. And she won silver in high jump, but only after she and gold medalist Jean Shiley had to go into a jump off. She was disqualified in the jump off for using a headfirst technique to go over the bar, even though that was the exact same technique she'd used through the entire competition. So, there's that.
There was some interesting debate I read about that, of people saying that she did the same technique through the whole competition. Then the judges saying, well, I don't know about that. And so that bumped her to silver, but whatever.
If it had not been for the 3-event rule, she would have won even more medals. Apparently,
probably.
Probably. Yes. I'm just going to assume. Apparently, Thorpe had heard of her and wanted to see her compete, but he didn't have the money to buy a ticket to the games. When U.S. Vice President Charles Curtis heard about this, he invited Thorpe to join him in his private box to watch, which, good for him.
That's
because,
cool.
I mean, it's Jim Thorpe, like, give him whatever the guy wants. I don't care. So I'm like, it's
seriously.
It's good to know that he recognized that Thorpe should be there.
Yeah.
She became a superstar after the games, partly because of her triumphs and partly because of how brash she was, especially in challenging sexist stereotypes about women in sports. She also ended up marrying pro wrestler George Zaharis in 1938. So, some people may not have recognized her because down here in Texas, I know that everything always became about like the Babe Zaharis Museum and the Babe Zaharis statue and stuff. So anyway, if Didrikson at first did not sound familiar to people, Zaharis probably brought it home.
Yeah. And see, that's strange to me. And probably because even though I'm from Texas, I'm not from that area. And so I haven't seen those things that you're talking about because I've always heard her referred to as Babe Didrikson. So, like in anything I've ever read about her, but that's because most of the reading I've done about her has been from prior to her marriage. So
no, that's fair.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've seen it Babe Didrikson Zaharis a lot too.
Yeah.
To where they give her credit in both names, but
right.
But yeah, I mean, either way, she was a giant in her own accord. And then after the Olympics, she took up golf. And what a surprise, she turned out to be awesome at that too. In fact, by 1950, she'd won every single available women's title at least once. She won the U.S. Women's Open 3 times, including in 1954 after she had been diagnosed with colon cancer. Speaking of, after her diagnosis, she used her status to raise money for cancer research and became a spokesperson for the American Cancer Society. Unfortunately, she died of cancer in 1956 at the age of 45.
Yeah, that's just a bummer. I mean, you think about the impact that she already had on women's sports at that point, and you just kind of think of the lost opportunity for her to continue having that impact, that she could have had, but. I love the silver lining that she used her status to contribute and help out with the American Cancer Society at a time when a lot of this cancer research, frankly, was just getting off the ground, really. So, good for her recognizing that she could elevate a cause, even though, ultimately she did pass away of it, unfortunately.
Yep.
Oh man, I hate sad stories.
I know.
But still, I think again, this is why we started up this show, though, so that we can remember these individuals and the impact that they made, not just in sports, but in these other areas of their life too. So that's really what it's about at the end of the day. But yeah. Let's go ahead and kind of jump over to some things happening in men's athletics. So you kind of mentioned this a little bit in the highlights, but let's talk about the 100-meter event, because that's always a big deal in men's athletics. So over there, we saw Eddie Tolan and Ralph Metcalfe of the U.S. face off against each other in the final. Now, here's where we get to see the photo finish used that you had talked about. So here in the finish, it took them actually several hours of looking at the photography to review it and determine who actually was the winner. That's how close it was. So people watching the race initially thought Metcalfe was the winner, but after reviewing the photography, officials declared Eddie Tolan the winner. Because, even though they crossed the line in a dead heat, their determination was because Tolan's entire torso was over the line in the photo that they reviewed. Okay, so a little bit controversial based on, how it would be judged today. But again, different time. Those were the rules they went by then. So this made Tolan the first African-American man to win the 100-meter and be deemed the fastest man in the world. So trailblazer there. And you know what? That was going to be true no matter who ended up being declared the winner, because Ralph Metcalfe was also African-American, which we'll get into here in a second. So Tolan was nicknamed the Midnight Express, and he also ended up winning gold in the 200-meter event. He was only 5'6", which shout out because that's my height. And he would chew gum while he raced to relieve stress. And he also wore a bandage on his left knee due to an old football injury. And also, if that's not enough, he would also use adhesive tape to keep his glasses in place. So if you look up pictures of him, there's one I found online that was a close-up, and you can actually see, like, on the side of his face, you can see these white strips of tape that are holding his glasses in place. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm just thinking about this guy, 5'6", glasses, tape to his face, wearing a knee brace, basically on one leg, and getting a gold in 2 events here. But let's talk about Ralph Metcalfe here for a second too, who was awarded the silver in the 100 meter. Because they did cross the line together, they were considered joint world record holders because their times were identical. Okay. Now, Metcalfe was convinced that it should have just been regarded as a tie. And later on, the AAU actually did support this claim, but the IOC never changed the results on their end. Okay. So if you ask the AAU, they say 100 meter for 1932 was a tie. There should have been 2 gold medalists. Now, Metcalfe would return to the Olympics for the 1936 Games in Berlin, where he would win another silver in the 100 meter, this time coming second to none other than Jesse Owens, who, of course, we will hear about in that episode. And then Metcalfe also did finally get a chance to win a gold medal because he was a part of the relay team with Owens. So I'm glad that he did get a gold finally, because this is a tough situation when you have these photo finishes back at this point. And a lot of people nowadays, from the reading I was doing, say that if you were going by modern rules, he would have been declared the gold medal winner in the 100 meter, because if you look at the photo, he's the first one with a part of his body over the line. And the judges at that time based it on Toland's torso being over the line. So, you can go either way on it, but I'm glad he got a gold medal in 1936, finally. Yeah. And then here's what's really cool about Metcalfe, and one of the reasons I wanted to make sure we gave him some time in the episode, is that after his Olympics career, he went on to become a U.S. congressman representing the people of Chicago, Illinois for 8 years. So again, having an impact outside of the world of sports as well. And here is another fun story that we can't ignore for 1932 because it's kind of a doozy. During the final for the 3,000 meter steeplechase, a substitute official made an error. He forgot to hold up the sign for how many laps were remaining the first time that the runners passed by. So this led to the runners doing an extra lap. So they ended up running 3,400 meters in the steeplechase final instead of 3,000 meters. Gold went to Volmari Iso-Halo of Finland, who won by over 12 seconds. So kind of sounds like he was going to win no matter what.
Yeah.
Again, he's Finnish.
It's a pretty long time.
Yeah, that's not super surprising. Second and third place, however, were only separated by 0.2 seconds, with silver going to Tom Evenson of Great Britain and bronze to Joe McCluskey of the U.S. So here's the deal. McCluskey had been in second place at the 3,000 meter mark when the race should have actually ended. So when this was brought up to the officials that, hey, did you not notice that everyone had to run an extra lap because your dude over there forgot to hold up a sign? So the officials did go to the finalists and they told them, hey, well, and McCluskey specifically, they went to him and they said, hey, we'll give you the chance to rerun the race, the correct distance. But he said, a race has only one finish line. and just let the results stand. Now, from what I read, apparently he wasn't super happy about that, but I get his point too of, you know, what's the point in rerunning the race? Like, everyone had the same circumstances. Everyone was affected by the substitute official holding up the wrong sign. So, you know, like, is it really fair? I think his point was, is it really fair to all the other competitors to say, hey, we have to rerun this race? You know, it's kind of like a two wrongs doesn't make a right scenario.
Right.
Not that I have the credentials anyway, but Sarah, this is exactly why I would be afraid of being an official at the Olympic Games. I'm afraid I would be this guy holding up the wrong sign. So,
yeah, that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah. You know, I know our friends over at Keep the Flame Alive always talk about what volunteer duties and what official duties they would love to have. And every time Jill and Allison talk about that, I'm like, nope, don't give me any responsibilities. I will gladly watch from the stands.
Well, see, my desired responsibilities are usually things like putting the medal on, or like carrying out the medal. Or like telling the athletes where to go. The stuff like this, no, it's too much pressure.
Yeah, I would be okay. Okay, here would be the job I would want. I would want to be the guy with the rake for long jump and triple jump that just smooths over the sand.
Yes.
Afterwards, there's something really satisfying about that, of just making it all smooth again. I would be okay with that because it doesn't affect how they jump whatsoever. So.
Yes.
So maybe
indeed.
I stand corrected after hearing you talk. Like, yeah, maybe I am okay with doing certain jobs, but don't tell me to hold up a sign for the athletes. I would be so terrified I would make the same mistake. So,
yeah.
But yeah, anyway, moving on from that snafu. Do you remember in our last Summer Games episode, we talked about Paavo Nurmi? And we talked about how he got his 9th gold. And we kind of joked about like, oh, I wonder if he was okay with not hitting double digits. You remember that whole conversation?
I do.
Well, apparently he did want to try to get a 10th gold medal because he actually entered for the 1932 marathon. Here's the thing. Even though he'd never competed in a full marathon before, he was still considered a favorite to win the marathon because, well, he's Paavo.
Yeah. Yeah. If you've listened, you know, Paavo, he was pretty good.
Yeah. That's like understatement of the year. Like, yeah, he was really good at long distance. So yeah, like throwing him into the marathon just kind of seems like a no-brainer. So here we go. Here, our guy Paavo, he travels all the way to LA for the games, which, you know, he had to go to, kind of like we were talking about earlier, he had to go to New York, he had to get on a train, travel literally across the United States. But just 3 days before the start of the games, the IOC deemed him a professional due to the fact that he'd been paid during an athletic tour that he had participated in Germany. So yeah, so they said, nope, Paavo, you're not an amateur anymore, so you cannot run in the marathon. There was a lot of tension between the Finnish and the Swedes over this because the Finns claimed that the Swedes had nefariously campaigned against Nurmi. Like, they said they were the ones who kind of dropped this hint to the IOC that, hey, did you know that Paavo got paid for some races that he ran in Germany? So he was not allowed to run the marathon in LA. So he ended up just going back home to Finland. He opened a clothing store and he became an apartment developer in Helsinki and ended up becoming a pretty wealthy dude from all of that. So I guess it all worked out for him in the end.
Yeah.
There's that.
Yeah. And again, we've said it before, nine
gold medals.
That's not anything to hang your head about.
No, not at all. But yeah, so we'll kind of segue then into the marathon. So with him out of the way as the favorite, we have to talk about who was actually there at the marathon. So 2 of the favorites were British runners Sam Ferris and Duncan McLeod Wright, with another contender being Finnish runner Armis Toivonen. Then there was also an Argentine runner, Juan Carlos Zabala, who had run in the American trial for the marathon so that he could acclimate to, the weather conditions, climate, all that good stuff. So the marathon started and ended at the Coliseum, and Zabala of Argentina was in the lead pack of 5 runners for 24 miles. Then he started to struggle as the race went on, and Sam Ferris of Team GB was in 4th, but started to close in as he surged. But ultimately, Ferris was unable to fully close the gap, and Zabala won by 19 seconds, which is still pretty close in a marathon, all things considered. Now, Ferris ended up winning silver, and then Armas Toivonen was just 17 seconds behind him for the bronze. Also, something that I want to note about the marathon that I think we should mention is that all 3 of Japan's marathon runners made it into the top 10, which is a pretty big deal, even though none of them medaled. I know we've talked about this a little bit before, that people love the marathon in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Like, seriously, all 3 in the top 10 is wild.
Yeah, that's great. Like you said, it is a big deal. It's significant for sure.
Yeah. But yeah, fun to see someone from Argentina win here and see some long distance success for South America. So on that note, we're going to take a quick little break, and then we will close out 1932 when we come back.
All right, finally, we're going to close out with the legacy of these Los Angeles Games. So the Games closed out on August 14th with the final medal table tally looking like this. The United States led with 110 medals total, 44 were gold. Italy won 37 medals with 13 gold. Sweden won 26 total with 11 gold. And Finland also won 26 with 5 gold. The Games ended with another huge crowd in the Coliseum. According to Olympedia, it was an emotional closing ceremony, with the crowd joining the Olympic chorus and singing Aloha as the sun set. Even though the Games were not as well attended by athletes due to the Great Depression, they're still considered a success overall because they were really well run, and their model for the Olympic Village became the gold standard to follow by subsequent Games. It was also reported by newspapers at the time that the Games actually turned a profit of around $1 million. But they tend to get overshadowed by the events that would follow 4 years later in Berlin, Germany.
Yeah. So kind of like we said at the top of the episode, that's why we want to make sure we tell these stories and we remember these games, because they do get overshadowed by certain other historical events that we're going to get into. But it is cool to hear that even though the international participation was lower, it sounds like people in the area really loved it. Mm-hmm. And like there was, despite the fact that the Depression was still very much going on at this point and people were still suffering financially, it sounds like at least in the LA area, this gave people a bright spot and it gave them kind of a break from probably what else was going on in their lives at the time, which is kind of nice to think about. So again, that's kind of the fun of why we love the Olympics so much, is they do give us these moments that kind of transcend other events that may be happening in the world and kind of remember what makes us human and what makes, you know, life worth living at the end of the day. So sounds like it was a really great closing ceremony. And, you know, I don't know, there's just something really nice about this thought of everybody singing together as the sun sets. Yeah. Kind of just a very pleasant picture with that. But yeah, that being said, our next few episodes, we're headed over to Germany. So things are going to get real. So, you know, our next episode, obviously, we'll be talking about the Winter Games in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. And eventually I'll learn how to say that correctly, hopefully. There's a good chance when we get back to the Summer Games for Berlin, I have a feeling, Sarah, we're probably going to need a couple of episodes to fully cover those games just to do them justice. Yeah.
No, I agree.
So anyway, we will get all into that in our next few episodes. But if you enjoyed this episode,
and we really hope you did,
then come back next time when we head over to Germany for the 4th Winter Olympiad in Garmisch-Partenkirchen in 1936, which, again, is going to be a rather significant year for Olympic history and history for that matter. But until then, I'll see you later. The Games Odyssey podcast is a production of Wardrobe Media, LLC. This episode was written, hosted, produced, and edited by Jonathan Jordan and co-hosted by Sarah Patton. Show notes, including research sources and transcripts, can be found on our website, gamesodyssey.com. Olympic is a trademark of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, USOPC. Any use of Olympic in the Games Odyssey podcast is strictly for informational, commentary, and educational purposes. The Games Odyssey podcast is not an official podcast of the USOPC and is not sponsored, endorsed, or officially affiliated with the USOPC or the International Olympic Committee or International Paralympic Committee. The content of Games Odyssey podcast does not reflect the opinions, standards, views, or policies of the USOPC, and the USOPC in no way warrants that content featured in the Games Odyssey podcast is accurate.